Night sky, silent and thick, split by a white flare that fell into a wheat field and did not burn up. Marcus Hale was driving home from a late shift when the light arced over his truck and landed with a soft thud he could feel through the steering wheel. He stepped out into the cold and saw, half buried in trampled stalks, something that was not of any world he knew. He saw skin that held a faint inner glow, hands that folded like origami, and a small leather satchel embossed with a composite seal he could not name. Marcus had spent 40 years patching roofs, counting pennies, and watching opportunities dissolve under a fog that seemed to follow him. He had been repeating the same surrender for decades. The thing at his feet whispered, not with sound but with pressure against memory, that the satchel contained a mandate older than empires, and that inside it sat the key to a vow that had shadowed Marcus for lifetimes. If you have ever worked hard and felt prosperity slip through you, if money or love arrives and dissolves as if by a tide, stay with this story, because what Marcus found inside that Anunnaki bag forced him to look into vows that were written into the body itself and offered a path to release. Subscribe and turn on notifications to see the full process and to get the pinned guide with practical steps to try safely. You are about to witness a rescue, a revelation, a ritual, and the real consequences that followed. This is not folklore dressed as fact. It is an investigation into an artifact that carried both history and a practical protocol for liberation. And if this sings to something inside you, know that what follows was recorded carefully and that its lessons can be applied. Marcus grew up in a row house that smelled of oil and fried onions, the youngest of 5 and the one who learned to fix things because throwing them away was never an option. As a boy, he read catalogs and traced tools, believing hands could be a passport. When he was 12, his father left with a list of promises and never returned, leaving behind a ledger with unpaid names and a habit in the neighborhood of muttered pity. By 20, he was a journeyman roofer, by 30 a contractor with a small crew, and yet the ledger of his life showed the same pattern, an initial ascent followed by a collapse that came like a storm. He married once. The marriage dissolved the month after they signed a mortgage that would have secured a stable future. He won a small lottery, a sum that should have allowed him to breathe for years, and 2 months later, a furnace explosion ate the money and left his reputation bruised. He had been called cursed at barbecues and joked about as unlucky at the corner store. But privately, he cataloged the losses like a vice. A map of shame. Marcus had a working mind, a practical hand, and a tenderness for stray animals. He also carried a quiet conviction that he had been bound to failure by something not spoken out loud. That conviction led him, night after night, to walk fields when his mind needed soothing, to watch stars, to touch soil, and to imagine that if any secret could undo this loop, it would be buried in the earth he loved. The satchel he found that night touched more than curiosity. It touched a recurring ache, a pattern that had shaped his choices. He did not know then that the feeling of things falling through his fingers was not random, and that the leather object at his knee would show him the architecture of his own soul. The wheat smelled sweet and metallic after the flare. The air tasted like dust and ozone. A fine vibration moved through his teeth as if the ground remembered thunder. Marcus crouched and brushed back stalks with a palm that smelled of tar and sweat. When he reached inside the crater, he felt a texture impossible for leather, a grain that was both warm and cool, like a skin that had been polished by centuries. He pulled the satchel free and heard, inside his chest, a sound like a bell rung underwater. From the corner of the field, a figure stumbled toward him, half translucent, clothed in a fabric that caught night and folded it into thin seams. The creature opened almond-black eyes that reflected the starlight like ink. Marcus reached out. The being said a name in a pulse that grazed Marcus's childhood languages and made an old lullaby unfurl in his mind. Marcus. Hello? Being. Thank you. Marcus. Can you walk? Being. I can, but the satchel must not be left alone. Why? It carries a seal that binds mandates. Mandates. Who put it there? The ones who seeded the ziggurats. The Anunnaki? A name that matches what you call them. The dialogue folded and refolded. Marcus smelled blood and ozone on the creature. The grass beneath his knees tasted damp with copper, and the satchel pulsed faintly like a heartbeat. He wrapped the being in his wool coat, feeling the fabric plume a shift, and carried it, awkward and careful, to his truck. There, under the single dome light, the creature touched the satchel, and Marcus saw a flash, an image of stepped structures, a seal hammered into clay, hands that swore oaths. Marcus felt his own pulse quicken, a metallic taste of dread in his mouth, and an ache in the center of his chest that had always shown up when money arrived. He drove with headlights thin knives across the fields, with the radio static like distant insects, and the satchel on the passenger seat humming a single low note. At the rented room that smelled of coffee and old newspapers, Jonah Reyes, the neighbor, and sometime helper, knocked because Marcus had called him in the panic. Jonah arrived with a toolbox ringing like a small chorus and a headlamp that drew lines across the ceiling. Marcus set the being on the couch covered in a blanket, and the satchel lay on the coffee table, its leather warm and humming. Marcus: I found this in a field. Jonah: what is that? It is not like anything I have seen. Looks ancient. It glows sometimes. You sure you want to keep it here? I do not have elsewhere. Jonah touched the satchel and flinched. The room smelled of frying garlic, sweat, and a scent neither could name, a resin that tasted like cedar smoke. The being's breath came like a cool draft. Its skin felt both porous and glassy under Marcus's fingers. They argued gently about bringing in someone with credentials. Jonah suggested Dr. Elena Morales, a professor who had studied early seals and had a reputation for not losing her temper in the face of the inexplicable. Marcus hesitated. The fear that whatever this was might take something from him, that attention would invite the same pattern that had destroyed his earlier gains, clicked like a lock in his throat. They wrapped the satchel in a tarp and drove, Marcus's hands steady but sweating, the satchel lying between them as if it were a sleeping animal with a mind of its own. Dr. Elena Morales smelled of library dust and lemon tea when she opened the back door of Marcus's truck. She was thin, hair pulled into a knot that held a few silver threads, and her blue canvas bag carried field notes and a portable scanner. Marcus explained breathlessly, the words tumbling like loose nails. Elena listened, her eyes moving between the satchel and the being, flicking with a professional calm that hid hunger. Marcus: it fell from the sky. That is not a scientific term, Marcus. Marcus: it did, though. He is telling the truth. Show me. She lifted the tarp and touched the seal with a gloved fingertip. It hummed at her touch and left a residue on her glove that smelled of wet clay and ozone. Elena frowned and took out a small lamp and microscope. She called a linguist colleague, Priya Kapoor, on a crackly line. Priya arrived hours later, smelling of rain and spice, carrying a stack of reference images and a portable laptop. Father Mateo, a small local priest who had once been a historian in a monastery, knocked timidly and offered a small blessing that Marcus accepted more for the gesture than the words. Lucas Bennett, a collector with a trembling smile and a reputation for bidding accurately on mysteries, arrived the next day with an appetite for provenance. Commander Saito, of a regional security task force, asked questions with clipped courtesy. Noor Aziz, a healer Marcus had met at a food bank, came with balm and a open ear. Amara Hale, Marcus's sister, insisted on watching every step from the background and spoke to him through the night on the phone. Each person brought a distinct scent, a different rhythm. Elena's chalk and tea, Priya's ink, Father Mateo's wax, Lucas's cologne, Saito's sterile aftershave, Nora's jasmine, Amara's laundry soap. Each reaction layered meaning over the satchel like sediment. When Elena opened the satchel under the strict fluorescent light that made the room smell like a clinic, they found objects arrayed with deliberate thrift. There was a flat mirror no larger than a hand. its glass not reflective of their faces, but of images that seemed to unfurl like pages. There were thin clay tablets sealed with impressions of hybrid figures, threads of woven metal that looked like hair but were cool and unbreakable, a small bronze key with a triangular bow, and a strip of fabric that bore stitches that moved when cornered by light. Marcus picked up the mirror and saw the texture of his own childhood house, not as memory, but as a film he had not lived. Priya reached out and traced script on a tablet. She tasted the air and said the language shared morphemes with Sumerian cuneiform, but was older and crossbred with something else. Elena ran a scanner and found isotopic anomalies in the metal that made no geological sense. Lucas whispered about market value and provenance, while Saito took photos and cataloged chain of custody like it was a crime scene. Father Mateo touched the fabric and murmured a prayer that seemed to slow the stitches. Nor pressed balm to the creature's skin and felt under her palm a vibration like a sleeping engine. The mirror was an artifact that did not simply show reflection. Marcus's fingers brushed the glass, and his throat tightened as faces rose from it, not just his own, but silhouettes wearing the stepped crowns of ziggurat workers, hands making vows under the imprint of a seal. The satchel, Elena said slowly, carried a device of recognition, a tool for reading pledges that had been stored as somatic vows in the tissue of living beings. The word mandate, when she spoke it, felt like a verdict and a promise at once. The first vision came when Marcus, alone with the mirror and the faint hum of the satchel, placed his palm on the glass. The room air shifted, the light lost color, the coffee smell reduced to char. Marcus heard a stone door close and found himself in a narrow corridor with walls of sun-baked clay. He smelled simmering oil, felt the grit of sand under sandals, and heard the clack of chisels. A voice shaped from dust told him he had been born in a labor quarter, that a vow was made by his great ancestor to surrender gains to the temple in exchange for the safety of the family. He watched hands, calloused and sincere, press a wet tablet into a merchant's palm, and he felt a seal hammered. He felt the sensation of trade and tax, of a family accepting a covenant that bent their line toward service rather than accumulation. Marcus's chest tightened with shame that had the taste of bread. He saw a ledger bound with wax where his name, or a name translated into his bloodline, was written and sealed. The memory had textures, the grain of the clay tablet, the sound of a child's laughter like a string plucked, the heat of the sun at noon, the whisper of a promise offered under threat. When the image faded, Marcus reeled, a metallic aftertaste and the feeling that his own hands had dug a channel for the vow to travel down generations. The second vision came unexpectedly when Priya, studying the woven metal, sang a phoneme that matched a seed in the tablet. The mirror responded. Marcus was no longer a roofer, but a trader on a river that cut through reed beds. He smelled fish and smoke, felt wet rope under his feet, heard bartering cries that were both hospitable and barbed. He watched himself choose to slip a payment aside to bribe an official so his shipment would pass. He felt not triumph, but a lowening, a fossilizing compromise that threaded into his blood. The decision was practical, made in a moment of fear, and it left a residue that operated like a charge, drawing later choices towards small betrayals of potential abundance. The textures of the scene were dense, the taste of salted fish, the touch of rope burn, the sting of coin, the metallic clink against the tablet, the echo of stamped feet. Marcus understood then how vows once made under duress could calcify into a mandate on lineage, a pattern that served a short-term need at the cost of future flourishing. The third vision arrived not in time, but as a layering, an overlay when Elena ran a sequence of light across the mirror. Marcus found himself in a ziggurat chamber where figures in stepped crowns recorded names and promises on tablets by lamplight. He smelled tallow, linen, and a subtle scent like old ink. He felt a weight on his shoulders as if someone had placed a strap there and tightened. The scene held a ritual of exchange, where sacrifices granted stability, but at the cost of an agreement that certain lines would steward service and never grasp permanence.
The voice of the being in Marcus's mind now spoke and said that the satchel had been used to bind volunteers and workers into contracts that preserved the ziggurat structure. Marcus saw the ancestral vow not as malice, but as a mechanism of survival that no longer fit a world where descendants could choose differently. He felt compassion for the hand that hammered a seal in a panic, for the mother who couldn't risk famine, for the chief who told truth bent by necessity. The vision's sensations included the roughness of linen against skin,
the salt of unshed tears, the warmth of a surviving child, a scent of dust and incense braided together, and a final ringing sound like a bell that confirmed the vow. These visions were not decorative. They explained a pattern, sabotage that arrives the moment prosperity surfaces, a subtle self-undermining that protected the family line from risk while erasing future possibility. Marcus understood that his life of losing momentum had a blueprint, a cellular memory that triggered when material gains passed a threshold. Elena cataloged the mirror and tablets and noted that seals had been used historically to tie obligations to living flesh through ritual recognition and social enforcement. Priya translated syntax that suggested a process, a recognition offered, a validation by witnesses, and a binding mandate. The being, when awake and lucid, explained in compressed phrases that the satchel had been a tool for creating community agreements that could cross lifetimes. Nor, the healer, felt along Marcus's forearm and described a constriction in his fascia that tightened at the thought of signing a contract. Father Mateo spoke of vows and the difference between a vow held for protection and a vow held as a chain. Lucas, whose instinct was to catalog objects and assign them worth, whispered that the market did not recognize the moral mechanics embedded in such devices, and Saito considered containment. The theory they developed was simple and terrifying. Vows can lodge into tissue as programmatic inclinations, and certain artifacts could both display and, with a ritual, release them. The preparation for what they would call a release ritual followed a method that combined scholarly caution and devotional clarity. Marcus and the group gathered supplies that smelled of grounded intention: unbleached cloth, a bowl of spring water, a small charcoal burner, a line of salt, and a piece of the satchel's leather to be held as a witness. Elena insisted on documentation. Priya insisted on exact phonetics when reciting the old words. Nor insisted on somatic centering. Father Mateo insisted on silence between steps, and Marcus insisted on deciding his own boundaries. The theoretical steps were threefold and taught in clear language. Step 1, recognition, required the person to identify the vow and state when and how it first appeared in lineage memory. Step 2, validation, required witnesses to acknowledge the social function the vow served and to give thanks for whatever protection it offered so that the release was not an act of erasure but of reallocation. Step 3, release, required a declarative action, the burning or decommissioning of a physical mediator, spoken words that addressed the vow directly, and a physical motion that symbolically removed the seal. Each step had to be precise, performed in sequence, and grounded in the body. The group rehearsed voice tones, breath lengths, and physical gestures. Technical notes were made. The mirror must be covered until the point of recognition. The water used to cool the instrument must be uncontaminated. The salt should be laid in a continuous line. And witnesses should stand in a ring that honored both communal memory and personal agency. These procedural details were small but crafted to hold weight. Marcus felt his palms sweat as the plan crystallized, his breathing a drum that counted down to a moment he had both dreaded and secretly longed for. On the night of the ritual, the air was cold and thin, smelling of cedar smoke and warm bodies. The circle formed in Marcus's small living room, now rearranged to mimic a chamber of witnesses. Elena held the mirror wrapped in cloth. Priya stood ready with translated syllables. Nor sat opposite Marcus and placed her hands lightly on his knees. Father Mateo kept a small book flat and silent. Jonah and Lucas recorded the perimeter. Saito stood near the door to safeguard the space. Amara held Marcus's left hand. Marcus cleared his throat and spoke the recognition out loud, each word a pebble dropped into a dark pool.
He said where the first recorded vow had been made, what it promised, and what it had cost. The room tasted metallic, as if the statement had called iron from the walls. Then Priya spoke the validation, her voice steady and patterned, acknowledging the protection the vow had once given and offering gratitude for its service. The texture of the moment was thick with damp light. The smell of burning charcoal added a bitter tang, and the sound of a low bell punctuated the transitions. Marcus felt the vow like a strap around his rib cage. It tightened as faces around the ring offered recognition, then loosened almost imperceptibly as gratitude was spoken. For the release, Marcus took the bronze key out of the satchel, placed it in a small bowl of water, and pronounced a phrase constructed from Priya's translations and Father Mateo's echoes. He then struck the key against the mirror once, a clear metallic note that made the room shiver, and placed the key into the flame. The metal glowed red and then blackened, smoke smelling like burnt bread and salt. Marcus felt his chest unclench. A pressure that had been constant for years fluttered like a trapped bird released. The mirror flashed images one last time. A child smiling without fear. A ledger unsealed and empty of demand. Hands reaching for a future without apology. Marcus cried, a sound full of years, and the room seemed to breathe with him. The ritual was not miraculous in the cinematic sense. The first night after, Marcus slept for only a few hours and woke with a mouth like cotton, a memory of heat along his sternum, and a curious lightness in his fingers when he touched his wallet. He felt both exhilaration and fear, an old reflex whispering that any gain would be stolen. Over the next days, he tried to withhold from making big bets. He accepted a small roofing job that promised quick pay. That night, when he signed the deposit, his hand shook, but
he stopped, breathed, and repeated a phrase Noor had taught him to anchor himself. He resisted the urge to create a narrative of impending loss. Tests, by design, arrived. Lucas suggested a potential investor, a man with deep pockets and a smile like a balsa log, who offered Marcus an opportunity that required an immediate cash flow. Marcus felt the old architecture click, a memory of delay that had cost him before. He paused, called Amara, and asked for her counsel. She listened and asked questions that stripped the deal of its glamour and exposed its demands. Marcus negotiated differently, insisted on terms that preserved his autonomy, and passed on the quick exchange that would have reactivated the old code. The sensation of choosing was new and tremulous. He felt his reputation shift as well. Neighbors who had once muttered now noticed his steadiness. Dr. Elena recorded the events and cautioned about confirmation bias. Commander Saito remained skeptical, but noted the release had produced a measurable change in Marcus's stress responses in a follow-up. Noor suggested bodywork to integrate the change, and Priya discussed the ethical implications of releasing vows whose community function had been protective. The tension remained. Change invites tests, and the pattern that had shaped him for generations would not yield without being challenged. 1 month later, Marcus sat with a ledger open and a new client who had seen his work through a recommendation. The client was Lucas's contact, but had done due diligence and liked Marcus's honesty. Marcus signed a contract that would have been the sort that previously triggered disaster. He felt the old knot and remembered the ritual. He breathed, let his hand rest on the satchel fragment kept as witness, and signed with a clarity he had not known. The small job grew into referrals. He paid down a lingering bill and, of all things, was able to fix the leaky roof of a neighbor without fear of taking on expense that would dome him. His chest felt newly spacious, and when he walked, people greeted him with a curiosity that was kinder than pity. He had pockets with change for bus fares and a paid invoice that felt like a tangible victory. Emotionally, he was guarded but lighter. He learned to notice the familiar urge to self-sabotage and to call it out by speaking aloud a phrase of reclamation. The bag sat on his shelf, closed and quiet, its leather breathing nothing like before. 3 months on, the change was more visible. Marcus hired Jonah as a foreman and paid him fairly.
He opened a small savings account, modest but consistent, and the bank teller who had once frowned now smiled and asked about his family. Marcus taught Jonah a simple practice of recognition for his own small compulsions and watched Jonah cry at the memory of a father who never stayed. Marcus began to volunteer at the community center and taught a basic carpentry class to teenagers.
His reputation shifted from that of a man who lost to one who protected. He was invited to an interview with a local news show that wanted to ask about the mystery satchel and the release ritual. He declined public fame, insisting on privacy for the being that had resided with him and for the integrity of the process. The inner work continued. Noor worked on fascia release and breathing. Father Mateo visited on Sunday with tea, and Elena continued cataloging the artifact with a sense of reverence and professional reservation. Marcus's heart opened to the possibility that he could hold prosperity without apology. 6 months later, he stood beneath a roof he had built for a small nonprofit, the beams smelling of fresh-cut pine and sawdust, a crowd of neighbors clapping and cheering. The roofing contract had expanded through referrals and steady work. He had paid toward his sister Amara's tuition and had a modest emergency fund. He had learned to negotiate agreements without defaulting to giving away advantage. His hands were calloused, his bank account modestly improved, and his inner voice quieter. He had taught a public workshop that combined practical carpentry skills with a short, secular adaptation of the recognition ritual that honored consent and community. He named 5 people who had helped him publicly in the workshop, including Elena, Priya, Noor, Jonah, and Father Mateo, and thanked them for bearing witness. The being from the field had become a personal mystery that Marcus never fully explained. He helped it to a secure place in a research facility where Elena could study it responsibly. The satchel remained a subject of debate in academic and private circles, with Lucas writing an opulent piece about provenance and Saito arranging for secure storage to ensure no commercial exploitation. Marcus learned that liberation did not mean the absence of caution. It meant the presence of choice. There were hard nights. Old reflexes would tap at windows when money increased, when relationships warmed, when fear of losing status crept in. Once, a month after the workshop, a long-standing client delayed payment with a story that echoed an ancestral injustice. Marcus felt the old pattern twist in his gut. He called Noor, who reminded him to breathe into the part of his body that had closed. He called Amara, who offered solidarity instead of solutions. He called Elena, who framed the delay in a larger context that made it less personal. Each call shifted the energy. Marcus resisted the urge to unravel the contract with self-punishment and instead placed a new recognition statement in his ledger, a ritual of accountability to himself. Over months, the intensity of tests diminished, the reflexes softened, and a new default emerged. Pause, name, validate, choose. The artifact did not become a cure-all. It remained an object of wonder and of academic strain. Priya published a paper describing the composite language and arguing for careful ethical protocols in dealing with objects that interfaced with embodied memory. Elena continued her study and called for collaboration between archaeologists and community ethicists. Father Mateo wrote quietly about vows and freedom, and Noor developed a somatic protocol for integration. Marcus started a small community circle where people could learn the 3 steps in a secular framework and practice them with witnesses, stressing consent and honoring the social functions of old vows while refusing their imposition on new lives. The community was cautious but grateful. People shared one word in the comments of a local post: money, love, trust, voice. The conversation spread. If you resonated with Marcus's journey and you have a pattern you repeatedly encounter, comment below with one word that names it. By sharing, we can shape future videos to address the patterns you most need help with. If you want to try a safe adaptation of the ritual described here, the pinned comment contains a short guide and a checklist for consent and integration. Remember, the process is not a miracle wand. It is a staged reclamation that requires witnesses, care, and the willingness to hold both gratitude and boundary together.
At the end of that long season, Marcus kept a small photograph on his workbench of his sister laughing beneath a repaired roof. He had not become wealthy overnight, but he had stopped losing ground to an invisible script. The man who once expected loss now expected to steward his gains. The 3 simple steps he learned work as tools anyone can trial with care. Recognize the binding pattern and name its originating moment. Validate the function the pattern once served and offer gratitude so nothing good is erased. And declare the release through a public, embodied action that renders the original seal inert. If this story touched you, subscribe for more investigations that pair archaeological curiosity with practical rituals and for guides that support safe application. The pinned comment contains a practical PDF and a short integration checklist. Remember this last line. Change begins when a hidden vow becomes visible, and visibility gives us the chance to choose otherwise.